Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing this morning?
Good.
Good. My name is Kara Watchorn, and I am a park ranger. I live and work in Yellowstone National Park. Raise your hand if you've heard of Yellowstone before.
I've been
Okay, looks like most of you have. Have you had a chance to talk about Yellowstone in class?
there.
Yeah? Okay. Um, would anybody like to share what kinds of things you've talked about Yellowstone? I'll let you go ahead and raise your hand. I'll let the teacher call on you, and then if you want to come up closer to the microphone so I can hear you, that would be awesome.
We've learned that you have volcanoes and earthquakes and a lot of animals.
Absolutely. We definitely have earthquakes and volcanoes and a lot of animals for certain.
You have a lot of bisons.
Yep, we definitely have a lot of bison for sure.
You have some like beehive little volcanoes.
Oh, okay. So Beehive is probably a geyser that you're thinking of, actually. It's not a volcano itself. I'll explain that a little bit more later. But yeah, we do have features like Beehive for sure.
How does geysers push water up?
Oh, that's a great question. And we will have a chance to get to, excuse me, to get to some questions for sure in a little bit. I'd like to try and explain a few things first before we get too much in depth into the geysers anyway. I know that's something a lot of people have questions about as far as why geysers erupt and why they're even here in Yellowstone. So we'll definitely get a chance to talk about that. Now, you are in Eldon, Iowa, is that right? Okay, where exactly is Eldon, Iowa at in Iowa?
Can you explain? Can you maybe give her a piece of trivia about where we're at? Tell.
The Gothic house, or the American Gothic house, is in Eldon, and it's
Okay.
like near a big town called Ottumwa.
Okay, near Ottumwa. Okay, is that on the eastern side of Iowa?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought. I actually grew up very close to Iowa. I grew up in Nebraska, and I grew up about 20 miles from Sioux City, Iowa. So quite a ways still from where you're at, but I'm still pretty familiar with at least a good portion of Iowa anyway, so that's why I asked that. So you've been learning about things like volcanoes and earthquakes and things like that. Well, we'll get a chance today to talk a little bit more about those things being here in Yellowstone and how they relate to Yellowstone National Park. But before I get too much into that, Yellowstone has a really cool history too. How many of you like history? Raise your hand. Oh, awesome. I'm glad to see that. Sometimes I only have one or two hands that get raised, so I never know. But Yellowstone has a pretty awesome history. Yellowstone is the first national park in the entire world. And so it's not just the first one in the United States, it's the whole world. And it was created back in 1872. So it's well over 100 years old. It's getting closer to 150 years old now, actually. It just had a birthday on March 1st, turned 142. And Yellowstone has been a really cool place since people have been exploring here. People were exploring Yellowstone before Yellowstone was even a national park. And when some of the people first came to Yellowstone, they were coming out here actually because they wanted to see one thing in particular that they were hunting for. Let me show you a fur from that animal. Let's see if you can figure out which animal it is. Here's the front part of it. Here's the back part of it. Here's its tail. What do you think it is?
A platypus.
It's not a platypus. Platypus, it's their mouth that's flat. This is the tail part of it.
A beaver?
Yep, it's a beaver. So there were people that were coming out to Yellowstone to explore and especially to hunt for these beavers because they wanted to be able to get fur to be able to make like beaver felt hats. Sometimes you can still even find some of those today. And even ranger hats actually used to be made out of beaver felt. They're not anymore. It's kind of a man-made product now instead. But that's kind of what got a lot of people out to Yellowstone in the first place, as far as some of the first European Americans. We know there were Native Americans in Yellowstone far before that. We think there have been Native Americans in Yellowstone for thousands of years. And one of the things that the Native Americans came to Yellowstone for was this rock that's actually related to the volcano in Yellowstone, which is this one right here. Do any of you or have any of you before played Minecraft? All right, I see quite a few hands going up. The reason I ask is because this rock is actually on Minecraft. It is basically volcanic glass, and it is very shiny. Does anybody have any idea what kind of rock it is? In Minecraft, you can actually make it by lava flowing down and pouring water on top of it, I've been told.
Obsidian?
Yes, it's obsidian. Very good. We do have real obsidian here in Yellowstone. It doesn't exactly form that way, but because of that game especially, a lot of people are familiar with it or have at least heard of it before. Now, obsidian is a pretty cool rock we have here, and not only does it have to do with the volcano, but it also has to do with a lot of our history in Yellowstone, because these Native Americans came to Yellowstone, and this is one rock in particular that they used quite a bit from Yellowstone. It was traded quite a ways away from Yellowstone. In fact, we found pieces of obsidian that originated from Yellowstone as far south as Mexico. And one of the things we found is that obsidian can be incredibly sharp, and it can be made into a point. Do any of you have any idea what Native Americans may have used it for? If it can be sharp and be made into a point, especially.
Spears?
Yep, they definitely used it for spears. A lot of times looking very similar to this.
Arrowheads?
Exactly, arrowheads, just like this one. And I know it's pretty shiny, so it can be kind of hard to see sometimes. But that's a good example of an arrowhead. And there are still, even today, arrowheads in Yellowstone sometimes that you can find. You can be able to take any home with you if you did find an arrowhead in Yellowstone, because it's actually against the law. You can't take anything from Yellowstone. Yellowstone is a place that's protected. But yeah, Native Americans use that rock that we have here for arrowheads. And we've been traded for a long ways from Yellowstone. And in fact, today sometimes there are still surgeons that like to use obsidian points for their scalpels because it's something that can stay sharp for very, very long. So that just gives you a little bit of the history here. But I mentioned some of the other people that came here, some of the first European Americans, were those fur trappers and traders. One of the things they were known for is telling lots of stories about Yellowstone. Now, if you have never heard, or if you had, I should say, if you had never heard of Yellowstone before, pretend it was back in the 1800s and you had never heard of this place called Yellowstone. And suddenly you had these fur traders that had been out here, and they were telling you about places that there was volcanic glass. They called it Glass Mountain. And there was places where suddenly the ground started to bubble up, and it made kind of splattering noises. And there was places that they saw that were huge, colorful pools that were so hot that it could boil an egg. And also water that was so hot that it shot clear up into the air hundreds of feet. And it could do that multiple times in a day. If you'd heard about that in the 1800s and you'd never heard of Yellowstone before, do you think you'd believe somebody telling you those stories? Probably not. And I think that was the case a lot in the 1800s in Yellowstone or around Yellowstone for the people who eventually became familiar with Yellowstone. They didn't necessarily believe those. Fur trappers were known for telling tall tales. In fact, do you know what a petrified tree is? Okay, a petrified tree, in Yellowstone anyway, the reason we have some petrified trees is because of one of the volcanic eruptions in Yellowstone. With one of the volcanic eruptions, that ash that came out of the volcano, it covered a whole bunch of the trees, and basically what ended up happening is that the cells of the trees got replaced by stone. So it turned into what we call petrified wood. This is another kind of rock now that we find in Yellowstone. It used to be wood. But there is one particular man, his name is Jim Bridger. He was one of the fur traders and trappers, and he was known for telling a story about Yellowstone. He would say that there was petrified trees growing petrified birds singing petrified songs. So, of course, the second part of it was just him making up tall tales, but there were really petrified trees in Yellowstone, and they still exist in Yellowstone today as well, partially, or I should say, because of that volcano that we have here in Yellowstone. Now, that volcano in Yellowstone, it's definitely changed the landscape. When you think of a volcano, I want you to pick one in your mind for just a second. If you want to close your eyes, think about what you think a volcano looks like in your mind, and then if somebody would like to share with me what a volcano looks like.
A big mountain.
It looks like a big mountain, okay. Would anybody like to add to that?
Melted rock.
Melted rock, okay, like lava, sure.
It could be really cold, so there could be snow on the top of it.
Oh, okay, so there could be snow on the top of the mountain, sure.
Cone-shaped.
Okay, cone shape, mm-hmm.
Like the shield volcano, it could be kind of low, but really wide.
Okay. Yeah, it could be more like a shield volcano, for sure. Anybody else? I'll take one more.
Lava comes out.
Lava comes out? Sure. Yeah, the reason I ask is because a lot of people have different ideas of what a volcano looks like. In fact, most people tend to think of like a big mountain with the top of it blown off, and there's lava coming down the side. There might be ash spewing out of it. That's what a lot of people think of when they think of a volcano. But the volcano in Yellowstone does not look like that today. The volcano in Yellowstone has definitely changed some, but that's partially because we had 3 different volcano eruptions in Yellowstone in the past. And the volcano that we have here in Yellowstone today has not always been in Yellowstone. Yellowstone is an example of a hot spot. Have you heard that term before, hot spot? Does anybody know what it is?
It's where lava's underneath the ground, and it can like blow out of the earth.
Yeah, it is. It's where lava's underneath the ground, and it can blow out of the earth, definitely. And that's what Yellowstone actually is. Yellowstone is a hot spot. It's in the middle of a continent. Yellowstone is mostly in Wyoming, northwest Wyoming. There's a little bit in Montana and a little bit in Idaho, too. But because it's a hot spot, and that's why we have geysers and hot springs here in Yellowstone today, it means that it hasn't always been in Yellowstone. In fact, it started a ways further west than we are. To show you, and sometimes these end up looking backwards, depending on what way we're looking at the map here. But just to give you an idea, the Yellowstone hotspot, we think, started somewhere around the Nevada-Oregon border. It moved its way up through Idaho, and this is where you'll find the Snake River in Idaho today, and eventually made its way up to Yellowstone. That green line there that you're looking at, that is actually the Yellowstone part right there. So that's the boundary of Yellowstone National Park. And to give you a little closer up view here, these are the 3 different volcano eruptions that we've had here in Yellowstone National Park. So we've had one that was about 2 million years ago, which is kind of the biggest one here. We had one that was 1.3 million years ago, which is the white circle. And then the yellow circle is the most recent one that geologists think was somewhere around 640,000 years ago. So it's quite some time ago that this happened, but it definitely changed the landscape of Yellowstone because, yeah, we did have lava that would have been flowing at that point, and it did have major volcano eruptions at those 3 different times in Yellowstone. But today, we're not having big volcano eruptions. Today we're having geyser eruptions, which is definitely different than a volcano eruption. And there's other things to show us that Yellowstone is still a very active volcano, but definitely different than it used to be. So today it is a hotspot, and there's magma is what lava is called when it's under the ground. So there's magma under the ground, and that's what heats up Yellowstone. So that's why we're able to have places with hot water in Yellowstone. And let me give you some examples of those to show you. Like this one, for example. This one is called a hot spring. There are thousands of hot springs that exist in Yellowstone, and these hot springs are here because of the volcano. Since we have that magma underneath the ground, it heats the rock that's above it, which heats the water that's underground here in Yellowstone. So this hot spring, the water is very hot that comes out of it. Raise your hand if you've sat in a hot tub before. All right, it looks like most of you have. Well, if you go and you sit in a hot tub, at about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Have any of you made macaroni and cheese or spaghetti or something like that in boiled water before? Or it looks like most of you have done that too. Well, when you do that and it's boiling point, does anybody know how hot boiling point is?
Who knows it? We'll try.
250?
Oh, not quite that hot.
Anybody else?
But you're pretty close, though, in the 200s.
212?
Yep, 212, exactly. So 212 is boiling point at sea level. Up here in Yellowstone, we're higher in elevation. We're more like between about 6,000 and 8,000 feet in elevation, so we're kind of ways up in the mountains. So because of that, our boiling temperature is actually lower, and it's closer to 198 degrees here. So here in Yellowstone, the reason I mentioned that boiling temperature is because most of these hot springs that you have here in Yellowstone, they are actually about boiling. Is it something that you want to sit in?
No way.
No, definitely not. It's way too hot to sit in. So it's not like some people think, oh, well, there's hot springs here, so that means we can go and we can sit in the hot springs, enjoy them like a hot tub. You don't want to do that because it's about twice the temperature. So we have those hot springs that exist here. We also have things that look like this that exist here as well. These are called mud pots. And I know it's not exactly easy to tell what they really look like, but it's bubbling mud that comes out of the ground in Yellowstone. And that bubbling mud that's here, the reason that's there is because that since Yellowstone is a volcano, it actually lets gas out of the ground. And when it does that, the gas can mix with water that's already on the ground, like from snow melt or from rain. It mixes with that, and it ends up eating the rock around it. Have any of you made Kool-Aid before with mix and poured it in the water? Okay. When you start to stir that around, what happens to the mix and the sugar that you put in there?
It dissolves.
Exactly, yeah, it dissolves. And it dissolves just like a mud pot dissolves, because that's what happens is the water is actually acidic, so it starts to dissolve the rock, and it makes mud because of it. Now, since there's still gas that's coming out of that, the gas creates bubbles, so there's bubbling mud pots that come up here in Yellowstone. Raise your hand if you've ever blown bubbles in your chocolate milk before. Hopefully none of you got in trouble for that before, but that's kind of what a mud pot actually sounds like in Yellowstone. And for that matter, if you go online, probably on YouTube or on Google, you can probably find some videos of that as well. But That's another example of what we call a hydrothermal feature in Yellowstone. Hydro means water, and thermal means heat. So that's why we have these heated water features in Yellowstone, is because of the magma that's under the ground from the volcano. And another example, which was one of the first questions that was asked, is this one. What's this one called?
What is it? Shout it out.
Yeah, it's called a geyser. Have you talked about geysers in class? Yeah, okay. So geysers are a little different than the other ones. Probably the best way to explain it so that it's a little easier to understand. Have any of you ever squirted somebody with a hose before, with a garden hose, with water? All right. It's the same kind of thing. When you turn on the water and you just let the water flow, that's like a hot spring, like this one. Well, a geyser is more like if you want to spray somebody and you put your thumb over the top of it and that water sprays a lot further, right? Yeah, it does. And so when you put your thumb over the top of it and it sprays, that's because your thumb is blocking it. And we know that the geysers have something that are blocking them too. And so that's part of the reason why they exist. So here's a picture of, this one is called Old Faithful Geyser. It's probably the most popular geyser in Yellowstone. And besides that, it's one of the most well-known throughout the whole world. Now, in Yellowstone, we do have a big concentration of geysers. There are hundreds of geysers, probably over 300 geysers. That's why Yellowstone is so special, is because it has the biggest concentration of geysers in the whole world. Besides other things, too. There's definitely other things that we have in Yellowstone that also make it special. But with these geysers, I mentioned, it's like having your thumb over the top of the garden hose. Now, you can get an idea with how big these people are compared to Old Faithful. Old Faithful, when it shoots in the air, it goes anywhere from 100 to 150 feet. So that's like a 10 to 15 story building. So just judging by that, how big do you think, and by seeing with these people there, how big do you think the opening is of Old Faithful? Show me with your hands how big you think it is. Whether it's this big, or as far as you can reach, or what you think. Okay, I see quite a few different answers. A lot of people are going like this. I see a few going like this, too. Well, I want you to go like this and make a fist. It's actually about this big. It's about 4 inches across. So it's not very big at all. And that's where Old Faithful is being blocked. That's a little ways under the ground under Old Faithful. But the reason we know that is because we actually sunk a camera into Old Faithful to see what it looks like. And that's what we found out, is that it's only about 4 inches across, so only about the size of a fist. So it's not very big. But that's one of the main reasons why Old Faithful is able to go up into the air like it is just like that garden hose. When you put your thumb over the top of it, it's blocking it. Well, with Old Faithful, it has a place that's about the size of the fist that's blocking it, but underneath that, it's about the size of a car, is where that water collects, and it gets so hot that there's enough pressure that it pushes it clear up into the air, kind of like a tea kettle. Have any of you seen a tea kettle on the stove before? Okay. And I know maybe not everybody's seen that in person, but if not, maybe you've seen it on a TV show or a movie or something like that. Well, when you have a tea kettle on the stove, that water is finally starting to get hot enough that it starts to boil, and all of a sudden it starts to whistle. Well, that's kind of like Old Faithful. Rather than whistling, Old Faithful pushes the water clear up into the air instead. So that's why Old Faithful erupts. Now, Old Faithful is a pretty special geyser, too, because even though there's about 300 geysers in Yellowstone, most of them we don't have an idea of when they will actually erupt. But Old Faithful we do. One of the things that we have found is that we can make predictions for Old Faithful. Old Faithful tends to erupt about every 90 minutes, so about every hour and a half. And one of the things that we found is if it's a short eruption of Old Faithful, it will be a shorter time until Old Faithful erupts again. So that interval time, the time in between geyser eruptions will be less. Now, if it's a longer eruption of Old Faithful, and Old Faithful erupts for more time, do you think it's going to take less time or more time to be able to have another geyser eruption? Okay, I hear quite a few people saying more, and you're correct. Because what happens is when Old Faithful puts out more water, that means underneath the ground, it has to collect more water and be able to take longer to heat up to have another geyser eruption and push that up into the air again. So you guys could actually be rangers too. One thing you can do is you can go online and you can watch Old Faithful Geyser online. There's a live streaming webcam. And starting in about a week, they will actually start making ranger predictions again. They're not doing it right now because there aren't rangers down at Old Faithful to predict it right now because the roads aren't open to Old Faithful right now. We're actually doing a lot of plowing in the spring. Our winter lasts a really long time in Yellowstone. We're now trying to get that snow off the road so that it's safe for vehicles and for people to drive in Yellowstone. So in about a week, they'll start making geyser predictions again. And when they do that, you can actually look on the webcam to see when the next prediction is for Old Faithful. If you use a timer, you can actually see how long the water actually spouts out of Old Faithful. One thing you should know is that there is steam too. So sometimes the steam starts even before an actual eruption of Old Faithful. And sometimes the water will come up a little bit and then go back down. And come up a little bit and then go back down. Well, you have to wait until the water actually starts going and keeps going and then goes up a little bit further. That's when you know for sure it's an actual eruption of Old Faithful. Now, if you time that, if it lasts for a minute and a half or less, then you can predict it for 60 minutes later. And if it lasts for longer than that, then you can predict it for 90 minutes later. That's how the rangers at Old Faithful do it. So it's a pretty cool thing that we have here in Yellowstone for sure. Hopefully some of you someday will get a chance to come visit Yellowstone as well. I know we've talked about a lot of different things, but one thing I haven't really mentioned yet is earthquakes. Have any of you heard anything lately about the Yellowstone volcano going to erupt anytime soon? Okay, I see a few people's hand raised. The reason I asked that is because that did make the news a lot. A couple weeks ago, we had a big earthquake in Yellowstone, but it was big for us. It was enough to shake things, but not enough to create any damage. It was enough to wake me up at 6:30 in the morning, but it didn't really create any damage because of it. But those kind of earthquakes we don't have in Yellowstone very frequently. In fact, we haven't had one like that in Yellowstone for about 30 years. But we do have earthquakes on a very regular basis. And as you probably know, since you probably talked about earthquakes some, what happens when there's a place that there are earthquakes is if you have a lot of earthquakes that are small, they can happen a lot more frequently. But if you don't have earthquakes very often, they're more likely to be a bit bigger. Well, we have earthquakes all the time in Yellowstone. Sometimes we have over 3,000 earthquakes a year in Yellowstone even. So it's not uncommon for us to have earthquakes. But it can be uncommon for us to actually feel them. So that one, it wasn't a huge earthquake. It was just big enough to shake things up a little bit and wake me up and realize that it actually was an earthquake and that it wasn't just a plow truck going by my house trying to plow the snow. So as far as being able to feel it, yeah, I could feel it, and it did happen. But no, there's not any animals leaving the park because of earthquakes or anything like that. There's a lot of earthquakes that we have here in Yellowstone, so that is not uncommon. And I ask that because it did make the news a lot. There's a lot of people that were sending me messages to ask about the Yellowstone volcano and if it will erupt anytime soon. We don't think it's going to erupt anytime soon. It probably won't happen in our lifetime even. But just to kind of give you a heads up, we're looking at a lot of different things as far as if the volcano would erupt again in Yellowstone. There's some cool things like there's magma underneath Yellowstone. We mentioned that before. But there's actually two places in Yellowstone that we think maybe it's the magma that's actually pushing the ground up. And we think that that would have to happen at a pretty significant rate, at something very, very noticeable. So we're definitely monitoring those. But right now, the ground isn't even going up. It's actually going down because it's like the volcano breathes. So sometimes it pushes it up, sometimes it pushes the ground back down. And right now it's actually being pushed back down instead. So there's a lot of things that we're monitoring. We're also monitoring those earthquakes as well. And with the earthquakes, we think before there would be another big volcano eruption, there would be a lot of earthquakes. Now, we already know there's a lot of earthquakes in Yellowstone as it is, but there would be a lot more earthquakes and earthquake swarms, so a lot more and much bigger ones, especially in certain locations in Yellowstone. So there's many things that we're monitoring to see if we think the volcano will erupt again. We don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime, but we will see what happens from here, I guess. We've talked about a lot of different things. What kinds of questions do you have about Yellowstone? I know there's a lot of things that we didn't cover, too, so.
What is your deadliest animal?
Our deadliest animal? Probably a bison, I would have to say. Because every year there's about 3 people that actually get gored by bison. So when I'm talking about that, I mean that a lot of times, and every year it does happen, people get too close to the bison, and the bison aren't very happy about that. And they will go and they'll use their horns, and they'll go right into them. Sometimes they'll flip them up into the air, but people do die sometimes because of that.
Wow.
So that's a big part of my job, is trying to make sure that people stay a safe distance from the animals.
What do you think your most popular site is?
I would say the most popular site in Yellowstone National Park is Old Faithful. The second most popular is actually this one. It's a painting. I may be able to find another picture here shortly as well. But this is called the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. It's a big, beautiful canyon, and it also has a waterfall in the background as well. And that's part of the reason that Yellowstone became a park in the first place, is because of this painting that you're looking at. On some of the first explorations we had to Yellowstone, we actually had both a painter and a photographer to show that this place that people have been talking about for a long time actually did exist. And it's an incredible place, and it needed to be protected.
How many people would visit for a day?
Well, that depends on the time of year. We get the most visitors in Yellowstone in the middle of the summertime. We don't have an exact number for number of people per day. We do have over 3 million visitors every year in Yellowstone. So that means thousands a day for certain.
About how many species of insects are there in Yellowstone?
There are a lot of insects. In fact, there are about 12,000 different kinds of insects, so there are a lot. One thing I should also mention is Yellowstone is huge. Just to give you an idea how big it is the size of 2 states put together. It's the size of Delaware and Rhode Island combined. So it's 2.2 million acres, over 3,000 square miles, so it's a lot.
What is the biggest volcano?
I don't know what the actual biggest volcano is. Yellowstone's considered a super volcano. There are other volcanoes that are considered super volcanoes that are also very large in the world besides Yellowstone. And that really depends on what way you actually want to look at it, as far as how big around a volcano is, or a last volcano eruption, how much magma they think is under the ground. So we don't exactly know.
How did the park get its name?
Oh, Yellowstone National Park got its name because of the Yellowstone River. And that name originated because of translating from between English and French and some of the Native Americans, actually. So that's kind of how it got its name. And some of the first people that called it Yellow Rock River eventually started calling it Yellowstone. So that's kind of how it originated, at least. The Native Americans actually called it something else, but it was lost in translation.
What do you do when there is an earthquake?
Well, most of the time we do not feel earthquakes in Yellowstone. As far as that goes, I mean, if there is an earthquake, one of the best things you can do is go to a door, go to the frame of the door and stand under the door. Someplace where there's not going to be large objects that are going to be able to fall on you and things like that. But once again, we have thousands of earthquakes in Yellowstone, and we did have an earthquake a couple weeks ago that I felt. But I've been in Yellowstone since 2007, and that's the first earthquake I felt at all. So that's been the biggest earthquake that we've had in 30 years, and it didn't even last very long or create any damage.
How many different animal species do you have?
Do you know what a mammal is? Yeah, okay. With just mammals, there are 67 different kinds of mammals.
What or how big does the clouds of the supervolcano go from? Can it reach Iowa?
Oh, you mean as far as the ash?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let me show you. It can reach Iowa, absolutely. One of the last volcano eruptions in Yellowstone looked like this, and this one actually goes about halfway across Iowa. So it goes quite a ways away from us as far as Missouri, so even and further south too, but yeah, it covers a good portion of the United States for sure.
About how many bison are in Yellowstone?
There are over 4,000 bison that are in Yellowstone right now.
What's your favorite animal at Yellowstone?
Oh, let me show you. Let me grab a picture if I can find it here. This is my favorite animal, and it's not something that a lot of people have heard of. This one's called a pika. And, hold on a second. Let me turn my thing down because I'm getting an echo. Okay. Let's try that again. This is a pika. And pika are cute little animals that are really into rabbits. They live where there's a lot of rock in Yellowstone. And one of the reasons I like this is to watch. They will live side of the rocks in the caves underneath the rocks. And they will come out of rocks to be able to collect like trees, like things like that, to be able to eat. One of their critters is they actually cannot live above about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which means they end up spending a lot of their time under the ground. So they're pretty cool critters out here at Yellowstone. And it's one of the small critters you have in Yellowstone too.
How many earthquakes are in a year?
Hold on just a second. I don't know why I'm getting some fuzzy feedback here. Okay, could you repeat that for me?
How many earthquakes have you had in a year?
Last year in Yellowstone, let me show you a map here. Last year in Yellowstone, we had 1,881 earthquakes. But we can easily have more than that or less than that in a year. Anywhere from hundreds to thousands.
Have you ever been charged by an animal?
I have, yes. I was actually charged by an elk. Let me see if I can find a picture of an elk real quick here to show you. My pictures seem to have disappeared. So I was actually charged not by a male elk. A lot of people think, oh, well, it was probably a male elk that you were charged by then. But no, I was actually charged by a female elk. Here's a picture of an elk. The female elk, they don't have antlers like the males do. And elk are actually a member of the deer family. So if you have deer where you guys live, they're the same family, but elk are bigger than deer are. I was charged by a female elk because she had a baby in the springtime, and I came out of the house, and she came around the corner and charged right at me, so I had to run back in the house. It does happen sometimes here in Yellowstone, and it's not uncommon.
How many animals do you have in all?
Overall, I'm not exactly certain. There's definitely thousands, probably even more like millions, because Yellowstone has 2.2 million acres. Just to give you an idea, I mentioned there's over 4,000 bison that we have in Yellowstone. There are over 150 grizzly bears. There are hundreds of black bears. There are thousands of elk. So there's a lot of different kinds of animals that we have here in Yellowstone, and I would guess there's probably thousands of animals total for sure.
Do you let people in with the animals?
Well, as far as letting them in with the animals roam around wherever they want. We don't keep them in any kind of fence or enclosure or anything like that in Yellowstone, so they roam all over the park. And yes, people do wander around in the same places that there are animals. But one of the things that we tell people is that it's actually against the law in Yellowstone to get within 25 yards of the animals. And if it's a bear or wolf, you can't get any closer than 100 yards, so the length of a football field.
How are
All right, looks like I have questions, or I probably have time for maybe 2 more questions.
How are volcanoes formed?
How are volcanoes formed? That's a really good question. I don't know if we know the exact answer to that as far as how they're actually formed. But here in Yellowstone, we know that Yellowstone is a hot spot. And underneath the ground everywhere, there is magma eventually. But in Yellowstone, it's much closer to the surface than it is in most other places, like in the middle of a continent. So in Yellowstone, we think the magma is about 2 or 3 miles below the ground in some places. Most places like Yellowstone in the middle of a continent, it'd be more like 30 miles below the ground. So it definitely has to do with how close magma is to the surface of the earth. All right, one more.
How many times does a volcano erupt in 1 year?
Well, as far as that goes, in Yellowstone, the volcano has not erupted for a very long time. And the volcano hasn't erupted, geologists think, for over 640,000 years. And we haven't had any lava flows in Yellowstone for about 70,000 years. So the volcano is not currently erupting. There are geysers that are currently erupting, the ones that are pushing up water, but no actual volcano is erupting currently in Yellowstone. So, all right, well, thank you all for your time this morning. I hope you have a great rest of your school day, and thank you for Skyping with me today. One last thing I should mention is that there's a lot of national parks. There's over 400 national parks in the United States. I know Yellowstone's a ways away from where you're at in Eldon, Iowa, but one thing I should mention is that there are other national parks that are closer to you that are even in Iowa as well, and some of the surrounding states too. So I hope that you get a chance to come visit our national parks. If you can't visit Yellowstone, definitely come to one of our other national parks. Any of them, you're going to see the symbol that's kind of behind me, which is this one, the symbol of the National Park Service. And it shows you the different things that we protect, like the animals, like the bison, the trees, and the beautiful scenery. Along with that arrowhead, like I showed you before, it represents the history that we protect too. So there's a lot of things that we protect in the National Park Service, and they're actually yours. All of these things that we have that we protect in the National Park Service, they are owned by you. So definitely, if you get a chance to come visit us someday, we'd love to see you here or any other national park as well. Thanks for Skyping with me.
Thank you so very much. Give her a round of applause, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.